Well, you're retired now, you're the former commander of the British troops. Presumably you're more free to speak out. I don't know what your constraints may or may not be. What does it make you feel when you hear that the head of intelligence, we're not talking about Stop the War Coalition, the head of intelligence is saying that actually Britain has become less safe as a result of British troops intervening in places like Iraq?
I don't think she said that. I think she said that the intervention in Iraq motivated a number of people to carry out attacks.
Well, I think most people would understand that as being less safe.
Not necessarily, because of course that could have happened in any case. I mean, what was the motivation for the attacks on 9/11, for example? We need to go back to that as well. But I think the whole issue about whether the radicalisation has stemmed from our operations in Afghanistan and in Iraq, what would be the alternative to doing it? Just to allow Al-Qaeda to carry out an attack killing 3,000 people and then just simply do nothing about it? Would that be an alternative? I mean, I'm very interested to know from Chris what the Stop the War Coalition's response would have been. It's easy for us to sit here in a studio and criticise the decision taken by George Bush.
Well, Norway has been attacked with a very horrendous attack, young people specifically targeted. And yet Norway has not declared a war on terror and asked its troops to go abroad or indeed start bombing the city from which this young man arose from. In fact, Norway
has troops fighting today in Afghanistan.
I'm talking about in terms of a response to directly experiencing an attack. It's saying actually we want to protect our civil liberties, we want to protect our multicultural society, and we want peace. So of course there were alternatives available. So now looking back 10 years later, would you still say actually that was the correct response out of all the responses that were available?
I would say about Norway also there have been a number of Islamist extremist plots against Norway which have been disrupted. Fortunately haven't come to fruition. We saw some recent arrests also in Sweden. They I don't think declared a war on terror either. But I think the point is, my view is that we did the right thing. It was right for us to eject the Taliban and Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan.
The point is they haven't been ejected. Al-Qaeda, the leadership's been removed, but many people would argue there weren't many of them in the first place. But Taliban, even now 10 years on, the Western forces have control over less than 1/3 of the country. And this is the richest, most powerful nations intervening in the poorest country, the least well-equipped, and yet they can't control that. So how does that bode for the effectiveness of military intervention?
Well, I think that's a different question. It's been a very difficult 10-year period. We've fought and we're still fighting to keep the Taliban from regaining power in Afghanistan, which would facilitate, in my view, and also I think in the view of our leaders in the West, would facilitate extremist groups re-entering Afghanistan and using it again as a safe haven to carry out an 9/11 style attack. We haven't defeated the Taliban. We're still working to try and defeat the insurgency against the Afghan government.
So why not get out now when we're being told that troops will be out by 2014? You're going to be back to the same situation regardless.
Well, I agree with you. I think
Taliban will be part of a power-sharing government. Yes, I mean, that's something very, very predictable sitting right here. So why ask those young men and women from Britain to risk their lives, and why allow further lives in Afghanistan to be lost? The fact is there's 1,000 attacks taking place every month now, more so than at the beginning of the intervention.
And have you seen the results of a very similar organisation to the Afghan Taliban, the Pakistan Taliban, the areas they control in Pakistan, the brutality, the murders,
but the fact is America's getting out. So
I know, but I wouldn't wish the Taliban regime onto anybody, whether it's the decision to get out or not. It is not something I think we should be welcoming, unless we support and agree with the absolutely violent fundamental objectives of the Taliban. I don't.
Well, that sounds a bit like you're either with the Taliban or not, and putting it in that way, whereas many people in Afghanistan would argue, no, we don't want foreign troops and we don't want the Taliban ruling over us either. And looking at the Arab Spring, it seems that people are quite capable of overcoming tyrannical regimes without Western intervention.
Well, I hope so, and I very much hope that's what will happen in Afghanistan. I would certainly not wish to see the Taliban with a voice in Afghanistan. I fear that may happen. But clearly what we should be doing now is to facilitate the Afghan government and the Afghan armed forces in developing their own ability to maintain control of their country, preferably keeping the Taliban out as well.
Chris, is that a successful scenario, do you think?
Well, I mean, I don't think, as you suggest, I don't think it's going to be successful, because I think come 2014 we're going to be in a very similar situation to to the one we're in now. I mean, last year was the most violent year in Afghanistan since the invasion in 2001. The year before was the most violent year up until that point. The level of violence is going up under occupation. It baffles me that you think that somehow by killing more people and throwing more bombs at the situation it's going to get better. I mean, actually, a lot of the people who have been central to the Afghan operation from the beginning are now starting to sing a different tune and are talking about, you say, what else, what other things could be done? Well, you know, there could be some question about trying to rebuild the infrastructure of the country. There could be some sort of attempt at diplomatic solutions. These are the things that many of the people involved in the war from the beginning are now talking about, and that surely is the direction we need to go in. Otherwise, I mean, the situation is going to be getting out of control. I think we also do need to break from the old idea that somehow the people who are in government in the capitals of Western Europe and America actually have the right to determine who rules in countries in Asia and the Middle East and Africa. I mean, for most of the population, this is an absurdly outdated idea, which is being clung onto by the political elite, and it's, you know, I mean, it's wrong morally, clearly, but it's also extremely dangerous. Because if it is the case, and I do believe it is the case at the moment, that across the Middle East and parts of Central Asia and so on, the population feels as if they are being dictated to by force of arms by the West. Nothing good can come of that, trust me.
Well, I also think there are comparisons, not exactly similar, but there are comparisons to the Second World War. We weren't happy just to allow the Germans, the Nazis, to invade and kill people in countries that we were allied to. Similarly, we're not happy for Islamist extremists, for Al-Qaeda to come and carry out attacks on our countries. I would be very interested to know, I mean, you can talk about diplomatic solutions, you can talk about reconstruction, but I'd be very interested to know what your response would have been to 9/11 had you been the President of the United States at the time. Would you have sort of just tried to reach out and negotiate with Al-Qaeda?
Well, I mean, you asked me a direct question. I mean, you said earlier what were the causes of 9/11, and that's a very interesting question. And really, it's a question that in the coverage over the last, whatever it's been, 3 weeks of wall-to-wall discussion about 9/11, virtually no one has asked. And any sensible response to a horrible catastrophe like 9/11 has to go back to causes. And the fact of the matter is, the reality is, and this is in no sense to justify the act, obviously, but one of the reasons why there is so much bitterness in those parts of the world against the West is because of the colonial, the way that America and the West has been dealing with the Middle East and so forth over the last decades, and particularly the question of Palestine. And, you know, if there's one thing, I mean, and again, this is kind of, rhetorically, this is recognised in Washington and London. But if there's one question that actually might be the key towards lessening the tension in a dramatic way between the Muslim world and the Western world, it is the question of Palestine. And where do we find ourselves after 10 years of the war on terror? Actually, the situation is more entrenched. Israel is still extremely aggressive. None of the grievances of the Palestinian people have been addressed. You know, and that would be an obvious starting point. There are all sorts of other questions in terms of aid, in terms of alleviating the desperate poverty that exists in these regions that actually has got worse over the 10 years of the war on terror. The kind of economic policies that are being pursued by Washington and London are creating, you know, desperate poverty. These are the things that need to be considered, and we all know this. You know, I think we just have to act on it.
Steve wanted to come in.
Just to add to that, I mean, the alleged organizer of 9/11, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who I didn't see mentioned at all in the coverage, who's still sitting in Guantanamo Bay, still waiting for his day in court, either in a military commission, which it increasingly looks like, and not in a civilian courtroom. The 9/11 Commission said he was not an Islamist, that he was motivated by anger over U.S. aid and support to Israel. Again, it's not to justify it, but just to say this is one of the root causes that the 9/11 Commission itself identified in terms of the person who actually organized and conceived of the original attack.
And do you think this has been part of the problem of the war on terror when it's being used in such an emotive way? And of course the deaths were so horrific that it almost has become, and some people would argue deliberately so, an area we can't talk about in terms of politics, because as if you are then justifying if you seek to look for underlying causes.
I was living in the U.S. when it happened.